turn it over to Vikas to introduce our guest speakers and the topic for today.
Sierra, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Before we get to our guest speakers, just a little bit about Enterprise Health. Enterprise Health is an industry-leading tech-enabled healthcare cybersecurity and risk management services provider. One of the longest NIST and high-trust assessors in the industry. Our broad range of information security, privacy, and compliance services include high-trust certification, third-party risk management, NIST cybersecurity framework and adoption, advisory and planning services, remediation management, incident response, business continuity. So I'd like to take a moment and just present my co-presenters for today. Real quick about myself, my name is Vikas Khosla. I'm the Chief Digital Health Security Officer at Enterprise Health. I'd like to call myself a healthcare security and privacy lifer. I've been doing this for over 25 years over various companies, for various organizations. And I'm certainly very proud to have two esteemed guests with us today. First, I'd like to introduce Devin Shirley. Devin has a 26-year career in information technology and security. Upon graduating from the United States Military Academy in 1996, he served 5 years in the U.S. Army, where as a Signal Corps officer, he was responsible for implementing and maintaining all information security and technology capabilities for his units. While in the service, Devin also earned his master's degree in telecommunications management from Oklahoma State University. Go Cowboys. After leaving the Army, he worked as an IT manager at a semiconductor company in Dallas, Texas. In 2004, he returned to his home state of Arkansas, where he worked at a hospital providing telecommunications support for multiple organization campuses across the state. Devin then accepted a role at Alltel Wireless as a product manager for mobile applications and later joined Windstream Communications. At Windstream, he served in various roles over 8 years to include managing technical support centers and managing design engineering teams. In 2016, Devin joined Arkansas Blue Cross Blue Shield and became the Director of Enterprise Information Security, and a year later was appointed to his current role as the Chief Information Security Officer. Devin is married to his wife, Amy, and is a proud father of 4 children. In his spare time, Devin teaches Krav Maga, an Israeli self-defense system in which he currently holds a rank of 3rd degree black belt. He is the author of Krav Maga Principles and Techniques. Wow, that is impressive, especially that last part, Devin. My next guest is Scott Matilla. Scott is the owner of M4 Solutions and has worked in the information technology and healthcare sector for over 14 years. In that time, he has helped several integrated healthcare organizations meet their strategic goals. This includes the development of sustainable programs to continue to meet their compliance, regulatory security, and IT objectives. For the last 3 years, Scott has also been an adjunct professor and sits on the Dean's Advisory Board member as a Dean's Advisory Board member at Duquesne University, Rango School of Health Sciences. In his career, Scott has led organizations to achieve high-trust CSF certification in and outside the continental United States. Scott has also supported organizations in conducting enterprise NIST CSF assessments as a third-party assessor, self-assessor, and strategic executive advisor. So welcome, Devin and Scott. Great to have you both with us today.
Thank you. Appreciate you having us.
Terrific to be here with you. Great. So let's cover a little bit of our agenda for today. I think we've got a really interesting topic that we're talking about. And, you know, in terms of looking at the world today relative to the importance of adopting cybersecurity frameworks, everything from the federal level of executive orders to OCR compliance and everything that's been driven through all the recent scourge on healthcare relative to ransomware and breaches. I think this is a really, really important topic for today, and certainly our guests and attendees I know feel that way as well. So we'll talk though, sort of go through this and hopefully impart upon you a journey that you will find resonance with and hopefully take away certain learnings and teachings. But we're going to tell it through the journey of one particular individual here, Devin, for example, and then Scott will also give us an industry-wide perspective, and I'll help to facilitate the conversation. And we're going to start with talking about drivers and alignment around your NIST CSF assessment or adoption initiative, and then talk about approaches to implementing the NIST CSF as well. It is certainly not a one-size-fits-all, and we'll delve into that. And obviously, very importantly, coming out of your NIST initiative and your assessment, especially the results, outcomes, and how you really leverage that information to drive your path forward to a cyber resilient organization. And I'll cover a little bit about how automation can play a role in this process as well. And hopefully you'll find some of those visuals interesting. And we have just a couple of poll questions at the end. It's always good for us to better understand the value of our topics and our events. And we'll ask you just a couple of questions at the end. So hopefully you can hang in there for that. So with that, I really want to start with sort of at the beginning, if you will, of a particular journey that an organization, an enterprise might go on as they're looking to adopt NIST, assess themselves against the NIST cybersecurity framework, and then ultimately achieve maturity. So let's talk a little bit about drivers for adopting NIST, the NIST CSF. And I'll start with Devin here, and certainly I welcome Devin and Scott to comment on common topics and have a dialogue amongst themselves as topics come up as well. But Devin, if you could start us off with what was really the driver for performing your NIST CSF assessment?
Yeah, thank you, McCuff, and thanks again for having us here. So looking at the NIST CSF, it's no secret there's tons of frameworks that are out there, especially for the healthcare side of the house. We have a lot of different options. And I'll just be up front and frank. We've chosen HITRUST as our predominant framework, but as we start looking at that, there's varying levels within HITRUST, and there are a lot of NIST CSF. But one thing we also found, we have customer contracts, we have regulatory requirements that kind of went above and beyond where we were at with HITRUST. Some folks are looking at ISO, but a lot of them were actually looking at the NIST, and we actually have some regulatory requirements and some contractual requirements that really wanted us to focus on the NIST. So we really had to make a decision. We're not moving away from HITRUST at all. We're actually trying to bring that up to the level to where we're matching the NIST CSF at the same level within the HITRUST. So it gave us a good opportunity to really kind of step it up even more from where we were already at with HITRUST, and to really move up into the NIST level criteria that we were trying to achieve.
Scott, as you think about organizations or attendees listening, what are some of the decision factors that you think they should be thinking about when they think about adopting one framework over another, and this specifically in this scenario?
It really depends. Every organization is structured different and has different requirements that are set forth on them. You have to think about what's the path of least resistance to meet the best outcome. And, that's kind of like deciding whether or not we want to do the NIST CSF. The one great thing about the NIST CSF that is viable in a lot of different organizations of every shape and size is it's a flexible and adaptable framework. And a lot of it boils down to cost-effective ways, right? It's cost-effective in approaching your cybersecurity and enterprise-wide cyber risk and compliance initiatives as well. So that is actually a business driver, and a lot of people that are choosing NIST CSF as that baseline to move their organization forward, and it's great at all business sizes and levels.
Terrific. Thank you, Scott and Devin, for imparting on that. So let's talk a little bit about challenges and opportunities. So you've made your business decision to go after and pursue the NIST CSF and be assessed against it. And Devin, specifically starting with you, as you put your initiative together, in fact, we had a question from one of our attendees that came in ahead of the webinar when they were registering that was asking about this. They were interested in understanding what your early challenges and opportunities were as you looked at this from a business lens, as well as from a technology implementation and security professional lens.
Yeah, and so opportunities is a good word. I always make the joke, we don't have a problem, we have opportunities, right? So that it's kind of funny that we use that term. But really just looking at all the challenges and the chances to improve a program. That's the biggest thing, is you have to look at it not as you're fixing a broken program, but you're maturing your program overall. And that's what you really have to kind of look at. Where are you at today? And that's your biggest challenge, is really identifying what's in place, what are your processes, what are your policies, and then identifying what that delta has to be to get you to a more mature state. And the way you do that is you look at what the CSF requirements are and bounce that and figure out, what that delta is. And then you start creating that plan to come back and really try to drive towards that. And then, of course, the opportunities there to, get other people on board within the organization. You never want to try to do anything in security in and of yourself as a silo, but really try to enlist everyone across the organization, sell the plan, sell the idea. Why is this beneficial to us? It's very easy to leverage. Audit requirements, customer requirements. Everyone wants you to have a framework, a validated framework that you work against. And so all these things kind of play in your favor, and really trying to leverage that to a lot of the stakeholders, why it's going to affect them, why they need to do this, and then developing that plan so that you don't have to be at a 4-level maturity right out the gate, but understanding that it's going to be the journey. And I think presenting it in that way as an opportunity to mature over time versus receiving a high-level point-in-time assessment, because it's not a contest, it's a growth tool to help you get to where you need to be long-term.
That makes a lot of sense. And how did you align your organization to this initiative, once you had made that decision to move forward?
I'm going to kind of go back to what I said about just really reaching across different organizational entities, everything from the CEO, CFO, even out to the board, and help aligning them on the message of what you're trying to achieve. And that pays huge dividends, both in, if it's headcount, if it's project funding, if it's tools needed to get you to a certain level, if it's cultural changes, if it's process changes. It's getting all those folks in alignment to really help you get the organization behind it. Because if it's run out of security, for security, by security, you're not going to get very far with it. It has to be an organizational initiative that everyone agrees is for the organization, and that they're all moving toward that same end state of where they need to be. Now, and again, telling everybody doesn't have to be perfect every day, but understanding that, it's that journey, and you're going to get there and improve over time, and helping people get comfortable with that idea versus they have to meet every point today.
And Scott, as I think about Devin's comments just now, one of the things that certainly I think about is, and we've got a broad audience today, is are there really, especially as we think about organizational alignment and culture, are there really any differences in the way that a health insurer like an Arkansas Blue Cross Blue Shield or others might think about adopting the CSF versus, let's say, a health system, a hospital, on the provider side of things? Are there differences? What should people be thinking about, or is it pretty much sort of the same regardless of what type of organization?
It truly is. There's similarities. There may be some nuances and differences, but the difference between a payer is the payer is trying to protect their members. The hospital system is focused patient first, so it's different missions, but the same outcome: stronger cyber controls. And leveraging the NIST CSF, they'll see those nuanced differences, but very similar. And what kind of going back to what Devin was talking about too is, as you're going to see, it's more getting through that communication, setting a common mission goal, setting clear expectations as you're looking for that organizational alignment across the various business units to provide them an understanding of why. It doesn't matter the type of industry or organization. It's more of, why are we doing this and why is it important to us? And knowing that ultimately we need to know what our bottom line is as we can continue to go forward. And there's going to be opportunities, as Devin talks about, is continued growth.
So in terms of security leaders within organizations, it seems like there's not going to be really a lot of differences here in our audience relative to those that are on from the health insurer side or from the health system side, and we actually have a lot of business associates on as well. So how should security leaders think about setting those expectations within the organization before they actually begin their assessment?
It's a lot of getting out and partnering. I sometimes say that it's a cheesy word, but it's true. It's working with your business units and your leaders and your team members to get out there, get in front of folks, say, hey, this is what we've got coming in, down the pipeline. And it's not a fire, it's something we need to do. This is why it's important to each and every one of us. Just know that it's going to be expected of you to provide us documentation, or hey, we may need to take a deeper dive here. Know that just because you may have a maturity score that's a little bit lower, don't be afraid. This is an opportunity to understand where our risks are. And I think from a leadership perspective, before they begin that assessment, is truly setting the tone. Without that, you're going to get pushback and delay. And I know Devin and I worked together closely on this before, but I think it's something is really building that coalition and sponsorship.
So it's Devin, it sounds from what Scott's saying, and you said prefaced earlier as well, that some of the sort of the cultural, maybe even political in certain situations, and certainly there's a prioritization issue or the issue of competing priorities. So can you talk a little bit about how you dealt with those issues as you started your assessment?
Yeah, it's just like anyone will experience this. When you look into competing priorities, you're really jutting up against resources, your budget, your time, your people. What are they dedicated to? What projects are in place? And then what customer-facing initiatives are you potentially going to interfere with? Because at some point to implement tools and capabilities or to do certain things, you're going to have to take systems down. You're going to have to make adjustments. And so you've got to work into all those schedules with all your different groups and make sure that you have buy-in across the board and there's an understanding. And once you work through that, you kind of overcome the cultural, you overcome the political boundaries and planning things out. And that's really key, is just getting the planning in place. And in the form of a project, we actually leveraged this like it was a project. And it was a very far-reaching project that spun off into many other sub-projects, but treating it that way and having a management perspective on it, and weekly updates, monthly updates, that sort of thing, that's really where you get a lot of that alignment. Because what we find is when people don't know what's going on, that's where you might get some of the hesitation and some of the resistance you encounter. But when people know what's going on, they understand why. That's where people really start to align to come towards a common goal.
Yeah, so it really sounds like there's a lot of awareness sharing, awareness raising, I should say, that has to happen early on, and a little bit of probably a lot of visits to different committee meetings and other types of meetings and so forth to make sure that people really know what to expect before this whole thing started. I couldn't agree more. When the hidden surprises are the things that people like the least. So good words there. But sort of leading into our next topic here around approaches that people can take. As you said, you formed this as a project right from the get-go. So in terms of thinking about projects and project management, how did you perform or did you perform a capabilities analysis, and how did you assemble your project?
Yeah, and Scott can probably help me on that. He and I work together on that aspect. But, take a look at everything. And we say capabilities, but I think I'd be remiss if I say you have to look at documentation as well. What are your policies? What are your processes? Start there, and then you can kind of roll into your capabilities and determine if what I have sufficient. Look at those NIST CSF requirements. If I have outdated AV and I need to be at the EDR, then you're going to have an update in your capability. So looking at things through that lens, and again, all these frameworks, they try to keep pace as best they can with a lot of the changing technologies and threat landscape. So it's making sure that you've chosen the right version of the framework you want to use, and then building off of that, going back to your documentation, look at your technology capabilities, and a lot of the elements that you have in place. And then from there, you assemble the project just like you would anything else, understand what the outcome is, determine when you want your timeline there, what resources are going to be required, what process is going to have to take place. Is it a contracting? Are you going to have to wait on contracting or legal somewhere along the way? Do you have to do it in phases as you get funding for your budget? All those considerations have to come in place just as they would with the regular project.
And Scott, did you want to comment on that a little bit? And I'd love to get into assessment approaches with you as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, as Devin and I experienced together in our journey, is we you talked a little bit about is setting up the project, is figuring out the baseline in the environment, and then what capabilities do we have that exist. But one thing that I've said this before in just other discussions is, yes, we're assembling a project, and you should, to make it that initial success. But long term, as you're looking at your approaches, how am I going to take that project and translate it into a program that is going to sustain within my organization? So as you're looking at your capabilities analysis is, okay, where is this going to be? What do I need to do to make this long-term and sustainable as well?
And as you look at capabilities and then you move into the actual, pre-phases of the project, of the assessment, what are some of the things that organizations should consider and why relative to the team and the approach that you put together to start to now actually perform the assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it's around tools and skills. We talk about capabilities, we talk about that skill set. Do we have the right skill set that exists? Do we have the right technology? And is there something process-wise that may need to change? Or kind of going back to the, discussing earlier, is there going to be some, from a capability perspective, some cultural or political challenges that are going to impact our success? What capabilities or support do we need to make sure that we've got the right sponsorship structures as well? As you move into getting into that assessment phase, is you need to have enough ammunition and capabilities, understanding where your weaker spots are versus your stronger spots, and where you may need a little bit more support.
And if we think about the three ways you can approach assembling a team to address this project, there's sort of the internally driven initiatives where it's all done within the organization. You can go external as well, and there's potentially a hybrid approach. Can you talk a little bit about those three options for our audience as they consider which approach is best for them?
Yeah, most definitely. And like I said earlier when we were doing the opening, is every organization has their own needs and budgets and current capabilities, kind of going back to the capabilities discussion. But so determining the best approach is truly based on the organization's current posture and design. You can do an internal, if you've got the skill sets to do an internal assessment, that is something that is a possibility given the structure of the team. I always, and I'm going to start with this, I always suggest that if you're not familiar with the framework, it is recommended that you get with an external party that can really help lay out your strategy and focus, as well as the processes. This is something that, like Intraprise Health does. They come with years of experience and help you prioritize, kind of help meet those outcomes in setting your path forward. And that bodes a little bit on what we call the hybrid approach, as well as you're getting external assistance, but trying to do this internally and set this right strategic path forward. So those are kind of what we would call generally a self-assessment or an assisted self-assessment, the hybrid approach. And then there's your external. And that's solely relying on an external entity to come in and do that assessment for you. Maybe you want it validated. So an external assessor that's qualified is going to be your best option. Or you need the extra assistance. You just don't have the capacity within your group or those skill sets to support that type of initiative.
And so, Devin, what approach did you ultimately end up taking?
Well, for us, we had some contractual issues that we had to really consider. And so we had the contractual requirement that we had to have an external look on our first NIST CSF assessment, which actually worked out in our favor because, we didn't have the in-house knowledge, and we've been working to build that out. And so we were able to get people to work alongside with those external assessors to start learning, and, we're still in that process. And so for us, it worked really well because we were kind of hitting two birds with one stone. We meet the contractual requirements to use an external assessor, and then we're building out internal for those times when we have to do so many external every so many years. But those off years, we can still conduct the internal, leveraging some of the knowledge we've gained by having that third party come in and walk us through how they do that validated assessment.
And in terms of the assessment itself, did you use a assessment in terms of information requests and responses as the findings, or did you use more of a validated evidence-based approach to your assessment?
We use the evidence-based. I'd mentioned earlier we use high trust, so we were able to leverage evidence gained during that and then apply components of that into the NIST assessment. But using that evidence base was definitely the way to go for us.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about scoping and what we call baselining. In terms of the scope itself, we know that is so important. NIST gives a lot of flexibility. As we think about some of the differences between a high trust or a NIST, high trust is very prescriptive. NIST gives you, flexibility to the organization relative to scope. How did you, Devin, develop the scope for your organization?
So I look at the scope and I'm really trying to move us more and more to that test once, cover many approach. And so, everybody has their SOC 2s, their whatever other assessment they're doing. And so I've really tried to take those core systems aligned under a SOC 2 and roll that everywhere, be it high trust, NIST, any assessment we do, we try to incorporate all those systems in it. So it's really how we do it, trying to move toward that strategy of having ideally one assessment each year, or a much smaller landscape from an assessor standpoint, so that we can try to get them all in one, or as close to one as we can. So that's really the way we determined it. Again, it's in the interest of efficiency in the end, while not limiting the results that we get from any of those particular assessments.
Well, I love that term of test once, cover many, and it certainly sounds like a best practice. But Scott, maybe you can talk a little bit more to us about best practices that people should be considering around scoping.
Yeah, definitely, and it's similar to what Devin was talking about, right? You're trying to achieve the easiest path with the least resistance, leveraging those other assessments that may have been taking place, such as your SOC 1, SOC 2, and potentially doing a crosswalk. But if you're really starting fresh, you don't have those assessments, is looking at your critical systems in your environment. That's where you want, from a scoping perspective, to say, maybe I understand that I've got 5 or 6 applications that are more critical than this other application. It's lower priorities, so let's focus on there, because that's kind of what the genesis behind the NIST CSF was, looking at critical infrastructure anyways. But if you've got the opportunity to evaluate and cross map to achieve that test once, cover many approach, by focusing on where is the delta between my NIST CSF and maybe my other assessments, my common criteria that I've already adopted and controls, that will help then set your baseline and priorities for your scoping. And then considering, down the road, don't boil the earth now, keep it simple and focused on critical, but then eventually you can go further out into your other system environments.
That's really helpful. And, as we think about a lot of the discussion, in the industry today amongst security professionals, is more and more obviously adopting frameworks and adopting NIST specifically, as well as high trust in healthcare specifically. There's also a lot of discussion around foundational controls, baseline adopted controls. Can you talk a little bit, and I'll open this up to both of you, about what role foundational controls play within the overall program?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good, David.
Did you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Devin.
Okay. Now, kind of looking at everything, the foundational controls, we're able to do that when we had, when we scoped out and we implemented one framework, and then being able to leverage that as a springboard towards a much greater level of maturity. And then, it's kind of using that foundation approach, and then you put your pillars on top of that, and then you continue to add the roof and whatever else you want on top of the building. But laying that groundwork was pivotal to us, because you can't just jump in and go be the most mature organization. You have to start somewhere. And I keep emphasizing that journey. We always hear it's the journey, not the destination. Because in cyber, you'll never get to a destination, because it's always changing. It's a moving target. And so those foundational baseline controls become critical because those are the table stakes that you have. You know, what from a regulatory perspective, customer requirements, or just even best practices, there are things that you have to do, and you know those elements must be met first. It's kind of like what, you know, even when I'll use my Krav Maga experience here. The thing we always say is you have to address the immediate danger. If someone's choking you, you can do 1,000 things, but until you address the fact that you can't breathe, you're not going to be very effective in what you do. So you have to address that immediate problem, get those foundational elements, and then you can build on that to incorporate more advanced things and really start to watch that organizational function grow.
Yeah, it's truly an exercise of understanding your basic cyber hygiene activities as well. Those are those foundational controls, and kind of as you're talking about, Devin, right? It's building, you're trying to build a cyber house. Well, you need a basement, or you need a slab, or you need a foundation to which you're starting off of. And since, you know, foundational controls are essentially that basic measure that you're going to start from as a basis, you know, that should always be taken into account into the planning processes. What do we basically have now, and where do we want to go? How do we continue to go up? It's not a exercise of, you know, where do we want to be, I guess, is we can take that into account as well. But as you want to figure out is maybe we've already adopted something. Maybe we already have foundational controls. Maybe we haven't adopted high trust yet, but we have some other controls. It's figuring out what is that basement, and then how are you going to build that first and second and third floor?
Yeah, and you know, for our audience, there are a lot of really helpful publications from NIST. I think about the NIST ransomware white paper that was recently published. I also think for some of our smaller, medium-sized organizations, 405D from HHS, they have a website focused on that. And fundamentally, these are all around foundational controls, whatever the name of the program or the title of the white paper might be. But a lot of these things that focus really on cyber hygiene, cybersecurity best practices, process related to in some cases, though they tend to be heavily technical and cyber related. There certainly are a lot of resources out there to help you build and prioritize your foundational controls. And if anybody has any questions in the audience about that, please chat that in and connect with us. Be happy to send you some resources. So I think that's a really important topic leading into then really looking forward to maturity, right? So it's an interesting exercise where you kind of have to define your maturity targets, or typically you define your maturity targets of where you're trying to get to before you start the process. You know, obviously things can change along the way, but let's talk a little bit about how you, Devin, you established your maturity goals for the controls that you had scoped for your organization. And I'd love to hear, you know, Scott, from you about some best practices about setting those maturity targets as well.
Yeah, so when looking at where you want to go with the maturity, this is going to be that moving target I was discussing. You know, you have to look at where you're at today, and you've got to be realistic in what you can achieve in the timeline in which you want to achieve it. You can set a 5-year and a 3-year, you know, long, medium, short-term plan, but be realistic in those. And as you set those, you know, start with the, you know, what Scott mentioned, the foundational, the baseline controls, and then moving up. Okay, I'm just going to use a very gross example here. Simple. You can't fix vulnerability until you first know how to identify them. Well, if you don't have a vulnerability scanner, that's your first control. Get a vulnerability scanner. Then you start working on the process. Okay, I've identified them. Now, what's my patching process? What am I going to do? What are my time frames? And you're building onto that maturity each time you look at it, right? We've got this. Okay, now we want to prioritize vulnerabilities, and maybe we're not going to solve for the first 1,000. Maybe we're going to do the top 10 of those 1,000. And now you're getting more mature, and you're actually looking at things through a risk-based lens versus a check-the-box lens. And so you're starting to mature that organization overall. So that maturity goal is going to change as you mature, and you've got to be realistic about that short, medium, long term, and just kind of know when you want to hit those timelines and be willing to come back and adapt those goals over time.
Well, and I think it's also, you know, Devin, it's being realistic. And taking into, I don't know, call it self-awareness or deep introspection, as I've called it before, is knowing that, you know, you may not be a 4. Okay, I'm a 1.5. What is the realistic goal of maturity that I know I can reasonably obtain within a defined period of time. It's, making that your goal, and then making that BHAG, that big, hairy, audacious goal, of being a 3.5 or a 4, that you're truly a leader in security. I think, as organizations look to establish those goals, it's all about continued growth. Yes, we all want to be a 4, but is that truly realistic? Knowing that there could be ups and downs that are going to be experienced. So just making sure it's realistic, it's within the budget, and making sure it's going to have the, best risk reduction and have the best overall impact to the organization as well.
Yeah, and it certainly seems like to me that as we talked about, sort of aligning the organization pre-assessment, that, making sure that everyone in the organization understands that maturity is a evolving thing, is dynamic, and that we're not going to be perfect right from the get-go. Sounds like one of those best practices as well to establish that early on, across the organization. So let's maybe move a little bit more into sort of the implementation of this. We've talked a lot about the alignment, the sort of the pre-assessment components of it, the best approaches to scoping and getting going and setting targets and so forth. Now let's talk about actually, performing the assessment, the implementation of it. So with that, Devin, right now, where are you, just to kind of set our own baseline for this conversation, where are you right now in terms of your adoption and implementation journey?
Well, I'm not going to give details on that, but I'll give you my philosophy and how I look at it. It's like in the Army, they taught us you've got to always improve your defensive position. And so I've taken that philosophy and I apply that. So no matter where we're at, no matter how good we are, we're never happy with where we're at. We're always taken to that next level. Now we have to balance that, of course, with business needs, requirements, resources, things like that. But kind of what Scott was saying, the realistic goals, and really understand how can we continue to improve and drive our position. Whether it's a 1 or a 4 or wherever, we want to be better than we were yesterday, because the malicious actors are getting better every day at what they do. We've got to do the same thing. And so that's really kind of the philosophy about adopted, is that constant improvement, that continuous journey that we're on, so that I make sure that, 1, we don't get caught unaware, and 2, we adapt as these frameworks adapt.
And in terms of what you've learned, the key risk factors specifically as you performed your assessment or remediation work, to the degree that you can talk about them, I totally get why you can't go into details here about your specific implementation project, but key risk factors, things that you've learned, what can you share with us, things that came out of your assessment?
So the biggest thing that we always have to look at is looking at it through a business lens. We hear that a lot, and I just got back from Gardner last week, and you continue to hear this theme of understand the business, understand what your purpose is, and understand you may not always get to do 100% security in everything you do, but the end game is to really secure the business, but still allow the business to be able to function. And so as you're doing that, those risk factors come into play with, what's my risk if I do too much of this or not enough of that? And you've really got to work with the, cross-functionally to determine how's this going to impact the business. If I do this, how's it going to impact the business? If I don't do this, is there a point in the middle where we can meet on that? And so that's where you really start to understand the risk factors. It's from that more corporate enterprise level view, and how what you do, what other departments are doing, and how that all works together in this huge orchestrated movement that allows us to run a very secure organization.
Terrific, thank you for that. And Scott, maybe you can talk a little bit more generally, sort of broad-based, based on your depth of experience here doing these things, what some our audience can think about as they think about risk factors that potentially could come up for them.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of similar to Devin's side too, but just know at first, it's not going to be easy. That is the basis. Teams have other priorities and focuses. So as I talked about earlier, partnership is critical. But some other things that we've talked about and that I would take into consideration as risk factors is adoption. That time, focus, just doing documentation. I know we all talk about it as it's great to have documentation, but if you don't have it, it doesn't exist. Or if it's in somebody else's, mind, it doesn't exist. It's getting that documentation is a huge risk. It takes time, but the reward at the end is there. And just be prepared that there's going to be some crucial conversations, and being prepared to have those conversations with your executives and the board is critical, and just being transparent.
Yeah, definitely. I think adoption is a key phrase, I think, in all of this when you think about such a large undertaking. If you don't really get organizational adoption, then you certainly potentially have missed one of those opportunities that Devin referenced earlier on. So let's talk a little bit about now, the assessment is done. You've got your findings from whatever source or approach that you decided to take in terms of performing the assessment. So Devin, in terms of the results and the findings, how did you, one, sort of go through and validate for yourself and, with your own team, those particular findings? And then how did you share that, the results and the outcomes with your organization?
Yeah. So when you're looking at it, I said before, you treat it kind of like a project. So everybody who's engaged, if you're doing it the right way, none of the findings should really come across as a surprise. Everybody should kind of know what to expect. Kind of like when you do a performance review, you review the person annually. There shouldn't be any surprises on that performance review if you've done your job throughout the whole year. Same thing here. Most of the people, if they're actively engaged, will already know what they're looking at, give or take a few items, but on the whole, it should not come out as a shock to anyone. And so what's crucial before you get to the final results is to really set the stage, because you know what it's going to be. Start setting that stage with your executive, with your board, if that's who you have to report it to, and let them know what you're seeing along the way. And then what the more important part about all of this is understanding, here's where we're at, here's our plan now, because now that we know where we're at, we know what the assessment has, we know where our weaknesses are, let's improve. Let's get in that constant state of improvement and really focus on the remediation efforts for what you're going to do over the next year, 2 or 3, to really close a lot of those gaps. And I think that's where you get a lot of the positive spin on whatever results you get. Even if you come out with a 0.5, hey, we got a 0.5, but look what we can do to improve. It's kind of like I was talking earlier. It's not a problem, it's an opportunity. We have an opportunity to mature, and now that we know what we need to do to mature, this is a good thing for us, and we can set the plan, we can set the stage for where we need to go and what we need to do.
And Devin, just a quick follow-up to that in terms of communicating. I love that, communicate early, communicate often, kind of a theme there. Did you use a scorecard, or how did you actually communicate that? Was it verbal? How did you let folks know as you were going through the process how things were going?
Yeah, it's both actually. Visual aids are always good, but nothing replaces the verbal aspect of it as well. And Scott was actually really good, when we worked together, developing some good visuals that relay information in a very simple format, but then it's keeping in touch with them and keeping that in front of them through a cadence of meetings, a series of get-togethers, some status updates, whatever it is just being consistent in that communication. And Scott, I'll let you kind of piggyback on that if you'd like.
Yeah, and it's also, when you see a risk is what we call purposefully escalating as well, right? Is bringing up the issues where necessary and know that it's not just an issue. Here's that solution that we're going to provide to potentially change or increase that maturity. It's just having that open line of dialogue and conversation as well. Because if you don't have that, it's going to hinder the project. It's going to hinder the adoption and future initiatives that'll be there.
Great, thank you guys for that. And so Devin, as we now look at sort of the path forward here and where do you go from here, can you share some, a couple of just key learnings from your experience, and where are you going forward with the CSF to the degree that you can describe it?
Yeah, like I said, communication is going to be one of the biggest things. Communicate often, communicate what you're learning, communicate what needs to happen to close that gap. And the more time you give people to fix gaps or anything that's come out of the assessment, the better buy-in you're going to get. If you tell, hey, we find something and you don't tell them for 6 months and you tell them, oh, we need it in 2 months, you're going to get a lot more resistance, and understandably so. But this, I try to adhere to the philosophy of 20% communication, 80% execution time. So I want to take 20% of the time to get the info out and give them 80% of the time to go forth and do it and fix the problem. It's when that's reversed, if when you have, you get run into a lot of issues and those competing priorities. So really try to get as much out there sooner than later, and then set the plan, communicate that plan, and stick to it as best as you can. And understand there's going to be some flexibility required, but hold to it as best you can.
Terrific. And Scott, you had mentioned earlier that this should ultimately be a program, not a project. And I know automation. I know you're a big believer in automation as far as creating a program and being able to sustain it. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just when we look at automation and tooling, there is what I would call assistive technologies that are essential to reducing the fatigue on the teams, right? So if you're looking programmatically, examples like, and I want to use this example, and I'm going to kind of probably bite into a little bit of your time here, Vikas, but the NIST platform from Intraprise Health, right? You're looking for something that's intuitive and provides it those guided methods to achieve your assessment. That's the goal. Eliminating those spreadsheets and what evidence do I need to provide? So having automation and workflow and assignment, those, to me is a huge value add and reduces some of those stressors that we see constantly within the security teams.
And Scott, since you just gave me a great entree there, I did want to talk about a few resources for our folks here as we wrap up the discussion around this. Hopefully everybody found that compelling and interesting to hear this journey that Devin's been on, and Scott's experience, really depth of experience in the industry. So for our audience, for those that are looking to really sort of cull this together and have an informative reference guide for how they can implement their program, also how they can communicate their program, as we talked about, Enterprise Health offers a free ebook that you can download from our website. It covers a lot of the best practices that we talked about. It covers a lot of the challenges and even opportunities and how to take advantage of them. So I encourage everybody to do that. And Scott, you mentioned the platform, and we certainly don't want this to be a sales pitch, but just to give people a visual on how they can leverage automation. These are some visuals that you can take a look at to see how you really can bring a program together. It is so complex to do this in almost any size organization that's taking up a NIST CSF adoption journey, that you really need to, I think, and we're at a point in time in the industry where we really can leverage technology, can leverage workflow automation tools, intelligent learning, collaboration platforms. And so this is a view about the NIST assessment platform that Enterprise Health provides, that Scott referenced earlier. It really sort of brings home and captures all the different components of your assessment and remediation planning work, so that it can really be a tool that lives with you, 365 days of the year, if you will, but also brings in the other parts of the organization and gives them ways to really look at what's happening with your program, with your assessment, even their components and where they participate in those things, and maturity scores and a lot of the things that we talked about today. It really is a workflow driven whole program platform to really capture everything, including things such as reporting, because we know that there are going to be different kinds of reports that you'll need for different reasons. So a good platform should also give you a lot of flexible reporting capabilities as well. So with that, with Enterprise Health, as referenced before, whether our services, whether our software, our tech-enabled services, as we call them, we can certainly support any approach our customers are looking for, whether they're looking to do it internally, a hybrid approach, or an external approach where they want us to do it all. Devin, Scott, thank you guys so much for joining me today. It was really a terrific conversation. I think some very useful, helpful, and hopefully informative content for everybody.
A pleasure. Thank you, Vikas. Thanks, Devin.
Yes, thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. And connect with us on LinkedIn. All of our LinkedIn addresses are here. So if you want to reach out and connect and engage with us on LinkedIn, we'd be happy to continue the dialogue. So with that, we'll wrap it up. And thank you, everybody in our audience, for joining us today. We really, really appreciate you taking the time. And hopefully we'll be talking to you down the road.